Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week, I kick off my series talking about the RPG for Warhammer 40K, Wrath and Glory, by talking about a very nutshell look at the history of the setting, because I'm going to admit, there are entire channels on YouTube dedicated to the lore. I will probably put a couple links down in the description to channels I like for the lore. But this is going to be just a very nutshell look at the history of the Warhammer 40K universe. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as I try to put this huge world in a nutshell. So, Warhammer 40K has a vast history, and I'm going to be trying to give you a very rapid-fire overview summary of it. So, let's begin at the beginning. Way back, there were two races. One that was simply called the Old Ones, and one that was called the Necrontyr. The Old Ones were masters of all sorts of life sciences, had developed a vast network called the Webway, which basically allowed them to get around instantaneously between worlds. They were genius, they were benevolent. And then you had the Necrontyr. The Necrontyr were born around a star that was absolutely horrible. The radiation from the star made their short lives ones of extreme constant pain. And in fact, they ended up having a very death-centered society. Well, Necrontyr kind of expanded to get away from their world after they found out ways to develop, well, basically generation ships. And as they started colonizing other worlds, they found out the horrible truth that the excruciating pain that they live in wasn't because of the star, or wasn't because of the star anymore. It had somehow been worked into their very genetics. Now, things go on. Necrontyr society basically starts going through convulsions and civil war and stuff like that. And an entity called the Silent King, their leader, the highest of their various dynastic rulers, gets the idea that they should have a common enemy. Well, the Necrontyr encountered the Old Ones. And, they found out that the Old Ones had all this vast biological knowledge. And so they asked the Old Ones, "Hey, guys, can you do us a solid? Can you make us not live our lives in excruciating pain?" And the Old Ones looked at the Necrontyr and said, "Nah, you're the way you are, perfect." Okay. And so guess who the Silent King decided should be the Necrontyr's ultimate enemy? The unifying force behind them. That's right, the Old Ones. And initially, the Necrontyr were doing great. The Old Ones were, of course, as any wise, benevolent society, didn't really have a concept of war. And so, they kind of were being steamrolled early on. Until they figured out what to do. And they used their webway and all their advanced technology, and they started beating back the Necrons. And they beat the Necrontyr back to their homeworld. And kind of told them to stay there. Well, being trapped on their homeworld, not being able to actually leave, the Necrontyr started looking at their sun more closely. And they found out their sun had something feeding off it. And in fact, that was the cause of the radiation from it turning their lives into utter horrible things. So the Necrontyr did what any such people would do. They found a way to trap it, force it into a body, and blackmail it into helping them. Well, the trick was on them, but the particular entity is the actual embodiment of death itself. Oh, by the way, this entity is called a Satan. They like to eat stars. It's kind of their thing. The name for them actually translates out of the Necrontyr language as star gods. Now, putting one in a flesh and blood body, something it hadn't really experienced before, it loved the sensations, and it got all its friends to get into similar bodies, and then they started back up the war against the Great Old Ones. Sorry, the Old Ones, not the Great Old Ones. That's a different setting. And they have essentially started just slaughtering them, pushing them back, and then the Old Ones, they turned their biological knowledge to where it belonged. And they created a number of warrior races specifically to fight the Necrontyr and the Satan. The Eldar were created to fight the Satan. The Eldar's abilities with psychic mastery even allowed them to create gods in the warp. And guess what the Satan were vulnerable to? Psychic abilities. To deal with the Necrontyr, you had the Krork. They would big, brutish things, really good at physical combat. So, perfect for dealing with a species that has a lot of physical fighting. And so the Eldar and the Krork pushed back and defeated started pushing back the Necrontyr. And the Necrontyr turned to their Satan allies and asked for a way to basically win. And, to live forever and to be through and done with their pain. Well, the Satan offered them a solution. The process of biotransference. Build a mechanical body. Transfer your mind and spirit into it. Live forever, yay? Well, it turned out it was kind of a trap. The first people to go through biotransference were and also the strongest willed, i.e. the main leaders, maintained their sense of self with some quirks, and their sense of identity, etc., etc. And then it proceeded to get less the further down, until you got to the very end, the lowest ranks of the Necrontyr society. And you pretty much just got mindless clanking robots of death. I mean, they have some semblance to follow orders and stuff like that, but they don't have any initiative, any free thought. And that became the Necrons. And they kind of had this idea, after they fought and spread out, that, you know what? All these races are eventually going to die. Let's go into hibernation. You know, the old adage, if you sit by a river long enough, the body of your enemy will come floating by. That's what the Necrontyr did. Oh, by the way, this whole thing is the great founding war of the 40K universe. The War in Heaven. Now, let's go on. Fast forward. The Krork will eventually degenerate into a bunch of brutes with Cockney accents that just live to fight, called the Orcs. That's with a K. The Eldar master psychic abilities, master the webway. Now, something happens. The Enslaver Plague. Basically, beings come out of the warp, start taking people over, and it's in whatever got rid of this, also got rid of the last of the old ones. So, we don't really know exactly what happened, but we know that the old ones went away. The Eldar, however, they had a vast civilization spanning the stars, built around floating mobile space stations that could go into the webway, travel somewhere else, called craft worlds. A number of Eldar went to the beautiful, lush, untouched worlds that would be called maiden worlds. And they would live there away from the others as what were called exodites. And this was sort of a golden age. But civilizations that have no rivals tend to end up decadent, seeking lives of pleasure, and this would slowly happen to the Eldar. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, humanity is rising. Humanity has developed massive technological leaps and bounds. By assuming 10,000 years, you're sort of entering a golden age for humanity. And humanity is starting to spread out. They've mastered the warp. They've figured out Geller fields to protect their ships from the things in the warp. And they're traveling. They're going out. They're colonizing. Technology is rising. They've developed a thing called a standard template construct. It is a computer and factory in one thing. And it has the schematics for everything a human will ever need to get a society going. You need to make tanks. It has tanks. You need to make atmosphere scrubbers. It can make you atmosphere scrubbers. You need to make clean fusion energy reactors. It'll make you clean fusion reactors. Whatever you need to start up a planet, it has the blueprints and the methods to make in a standard template construct. Or at least it will walk you through building the factory to make those things. And humanity also developed the first artificial intelligences. And these began being used to help man. And you probably see where this is going. These robots were called the Men of Iron. And something happened that caused them to turn on humanity. And this ends the Golden Age with a horrible, horrible, brutal, effectively culling of humanity. And then something truly horrific happens after humanity has somehow beaten the Men of Iron. See, the Eldar have gotten continually more decadent and cruel and, well, let's just say they fornicate a new god into being. The bane of the Eldar. She who thirsts, and the prince of pleasure. Slaanesh. And where this happened becomes this great warp rift. This circular hellhole, basically, called the Eye of Terror. And the birth of Slaanesh causes massive warp storms throughout the galaxy. These warp storms effectively cut off human civilization from itself for 10,000 years. This period becomes called both Old Night and Long Night, depending on who you ask. Earth, the Terra, the homeworld of humanity, becomes a blasted wasteland. Brutal warlords rise up and squash anyone who opposes them. Through genetic engineering, they create abominations. And during this horrible period, throughout the pockets of human civilization, humans develop here and there psychic abilities. And these abilities sometimes bring horrors to the world, unimagined, in the forms of what will be called daemons. And many worlds just absolutely die during Old Night. Some manage to survive. Some manage to prosper even. And on Mars, you have a religious cult worshipping technology rise up. This cult is called, well, it will be called the Cult Mechanicus. And at various points during Old Night, they send out exploratory vessels to try and reach other worlds. And these end up, at times, setting up a number of what will later be called Forge Worlds. Basically, worlds that exist to save, preserve, and manufacture technology. And at the end of Old Night, a man emerges on Earth. Maybe he was just the size of a normal man, but so many depictions of him have him as a giant. This man bears a eagle and thunderbolt crest, and he comes from the Himalayas, where he maintained a secret lab. He comes out of this with genetically engineered super soldiers called Thunder Warriors. And with this initial army, he begins a war of unification on Earth, on Terra. This man will eventually be called the Emperor. And he eventually unifies Terra. His Thunder Warriors are all killed at one massive battle under his own orders. They are basically executed by his own personal bodyguard, the Custodes. And at the later stages of the Unification War, the Emperor developed 20 genetically perfect individuals. Or at least that was the plan. Each one geared for a specific function. And from their genes, he created an improved army of genetically engineered super soldiers. That these would eventually be called the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines. But something happened, and all 20 of the first entities for these were whisked away from his secret lab and scattered throughout the galaxy. Part of the follow-up to the unification of Terra is what would be called the Great Crusade. And gradually, all 20 of the Primarchs would be found, reunited with their legions. 2, we will never know what happened to them. The 2nd and 11th legions, their Primarchs and them were utterly erased from all Imperial records. We kind of know where they are by where the absences of information are. But all we know is something happened during this horrible war called the Rangdan Genocide. And all that we know about the Rangdan is they were ossivores. That is all the info we have. But from there, the Emperor's Great Crusade marches out into the galaxy, taking and reclaiming worlds. And he finds all 20 of his Primarchs. One of them, Lorgar, gets this idea that the Emperor is a god. And so the Emperor goes, "No, Lorgar, the Imperial truth is what you're supposed to spread. That there are no gods, that there is no religion, science and rational thought alone." And then he destroys the perfect city that Lorgar had built to humble the Legion. Yeah, and because of that, Lorgar decides doesn't like the Emperor anymore. And so Lorgar finds out about the entities called the Chaos Gods. Khorne, the Blood God, God of war, blood, murder, rage. Nurgle, God of pestilence and disease. Tzeentch, God of scheming and trickery and change. And Slaanesh, deity of pleasure. And yes, Slaanesh is the really insidious one of them. But anyway, from there, events happen. Half the surviving legions turn to chaos and betray the Emperor. And this is a massive war that ends with the Emperor being mortally wounded But, of course, you can't mortally kill the Emperor because he's what's called a perpetual. So you can't actually kill him. Instead, they just severely wounded him, and he's been interred on a golden throne, fed 1,000 souls a day, just to keep him on life support. And no, I'm not joking. He is literally fed 1,000 souls of psychers a day to keep him going. But, following this massive horse heresy, the legions were vast things. Thousands of space marines. Well, one of the loyal Primarchs makes a decision. We don't want anyone to ever have that much authority again. Break up the legions, and he made them into 1,000 men, 1,000 battle brothers, which does not include scouts or initiates or those who haven't gone through the full surgeries and implantations. And these were broken down into units of 1,000 battle brothers each. And what then follows is just the Imperium trying to maintain the status quo for 10,000 years, leading us to the 41st millennium. Of course, during that period of time, someone came across a book written by Lorgar, the one that codified worship of the Emperor, and said, "Hey, this is a good idea. Let's do this as a way to help keep society in line, because the science shed, no one's gonna worship that. No one's gonna feed 1,000 of their kids a day to the big E based on science. No, we want to brainwash them with religion. And, oh yeah, let's create a whole sect, a whole organization, that sole purpose is to maintain this religion. We'll call it the Ecclesiarchy. And under the Ecclesiarchy will be a whole other set of organizations. The Emperor's Holy Inquisition, who can do whatever they want, have no overseeing authority other than a higher ranked Inquisitor, and can kill anyone or utterly annihilate a planet at whim, and no one can gainsay them, because they probably had the right idea. And, as I said, there's various battles over these 10,000 years. Some are against Chaos, some are against Orcs, Eldar, this new emerging threat called the Tau. Note, by the way, to the Imperium of Man, the Xenos, aliens, are a threat. Which is why there's an entire order of the Inquisition that sole duty is killing Xenos. The Ordo Xenos. Of course, you have the Ordo Hereticus, who roots out heretics, and then you have the Ordo Malleus, who root out any chaos infiltration. And by root out, I mean utterly annihilate with extreme prejudice. In fact, the very people who will fight alongside them tend to get executed after the battle, even if they won. Why? Because they know about chaos now. And yes, that was the main 10,000 year increment. And then we come to today. Today, the things have changed a bit. You see, when he was a young Primarch 10,000 years ago, Rabute Gilliman ordered one of the Mechanicus to develop something to improve upon the Space Marines. And this tech priest figured out over the course of 10,000 years what to do. And now, Roboute Guilliman was grievously wounded and put in something similar to the Golden Throne on his world of Ultramar. And then some really powerful beings, including the first priestess of a new Eldar deity, which is the god of death, came to Ultramar, healed Guilliman, though he did have to go into a special suit of armor for a time, and then he was presented his legions of Primaris Marines, the new, better Marines. He went out into the galaxy because just before all this happened, a great leader from Chaos finally, after 13 tries, succeeded on something. And he destroyed the world of Cadia. However, when you crack open a world, open a gigantic warp rift, and suck the whole world and all its people into said warp rift, things happen. In this case, it was a gigantic warp rift that cut the galaxy in half. The Circuitrix Maledictum. Now, all sorts of stuff was happening. Chaos launched a massive demon incursion onto Terra. The Adeptus Custodes, the Imperial Fists, and a number of others fought them back. The Guilliman basically declared himself the Imperial Regent because, well, the Emperor's still a desiccated corpse on a golden throne. And the Imperium needed somebody to lead, and as one of the Emperor's sons, Guilliman was the best choice, and he's also the only one currently active. And yeah, this kind of takes us to where we are today. The Indominus Crusade is fighting across the galaxy, reinforcing chapters with the new Primaris Marines, teaching them the secrets of how to do the extra surgeries and implantations on both new recruits and on those brave enough to risk death to cross the Rubicon Primaris. And oh yeah, the Empire's kind of split in half. So you have one half that's run by Guilliman. And then he'd fought his way to Baal in the other half of the Imperium, reinforced the Blood Angels and all their successor chapters, who were all gathered at Baal to fight a massive Tyranid threat. The Tyranids, think the aliens from Alien and Aliens, but worse, because they actually come to a planet and consume all biomatter, not just the sentient stuff. And that was invading Baal in a massive force. And so, that is the rough summary up to the present day of the history of 40K. I know I missed a crap ton of stuff. This was literally just the highlights. Next week, I'm going to talk about the sector that the game Wrath and Fury has as its default setting. So until then, I'd like you all to remember to have fun and keep gaming.